Okay, this is going to be a brief introduction to the Edtpa. In this class, we will be looking at the Edtpa as a framework for examining what good teaching might be and trying to tie it in with the Danielson framework, which is something that you will be doing as a practicing teacher in a continuous review cycle called Educator Effectiveness. More about that later. But for right now, we're going to just talk about what is the Edtpa, what are the things that it looks at, and how might it make you a better teacher. So when we think of what it is, broadly defined, we can say that it's a content area performance assessment of your ability to plan for instruction, provide high quality instruction, and use assessment in instruction. So there are these three different parts. When I say a content area performance assessment, it's because if you are in a social studies classroom, there are social studies specific things that you will be looking for, just like if you're in a math room, there'll be math specific things, science specific things, literacy specific things. When we think about these three tasks, planning, instruction, and assessment, you can look in the handbook and they have a really nice summary in the beginning of what to do. There's a big list, and as far as planning goes, you are really choosing a learning segment or a learning progression that includes 3 to 5 lesson plans. I always say that you should probably go with 4 just because things can go wrong. You also want to be able to demonstrate that you are building a skill, a complex skill. But you can do it in 3. Things can get a little dicey. You'll make lesson plans for it, you'll create pre and post assessments and so on, and there's a big list of all these things to do, different things that you need to submit, and then there are 5 rubrics that you will be scored upon, and we'll go over the planning stuff in the next video. The second part is instruction, where you take those 3 to 5 lessons that that unit that you've put together, and you actually teach them. You video record yourself 2 different times, one really giving the initial instruction, another time letting them model or do independent study practice, where you are going around reinforcing skills, giving feedback as needed, deepening student knowledge. And we'll go into much more detail into what that's all about. You really just have 2 things to submit in this, the video clips, and they can't be edited. They have to be within a certain time range, and all that information is given here and in more detail in the handbook itself. And then your commentary, where they ask you questions and basically tell you to show us where you provided this kind of feedback, or you had a good relationship with your students, and so on. And then there are, again, 5 evaluation rubrics. The third task is the assessment task, where basically you take one of your summative or end assessments that's supposed to allow the students to demonstrate what they've been able to do. In this case, it should represent, and it makes it easy, in my opinion, if you represent all the objectives in that progression, because then you can really pick things apart really well. And when you look at ones that score really high, it's because they are kind of deconstructing a complex skill and showing this is how people did in this part, this is how people did in this part, and so on. You'll bring in some student samples. You'll talk about and you'll show the feedback that you gave those students, and we'll talk about the do's and don'ts in there. And then you have these different things that you submit. Again, there are 5 evaluation rubrics. So if you are in the MCA, you are typically going to do literacy depending on what grade you're in. You may do math, you may do science, you may do social studies, but I'm going to be spending most of the time using literacy as an example. Even though the directions and the phrasing is slightly different in each content area, it's all trying to measure the same thing. And when we talk about the planning task, we'll talk about the 5 things we're trying to measure there. We'll talk about the 5 things we're trying to measure in the instruction task. And we'll talk about the 5 things we're trying to measure in the assessment task. Now, as far as scoring information goes, there are 3 main tasks: planning, instruction, assessment, with 5 rubrics each for a total of 15 rubrics. Each rubric is on a scale of 1 to 5 points. A 3 is where you, as a first-year teacher, is supposed to theoretically be. That's how the scaling system was met or created. Now, if you average all that out, right, an average of 3 on 15 rubrics, you should get a score of 45. Well, currently in Wisconsin, the passing score is 38. They may raise that, but in other words, you can get 7 out of these 15, or almost half of them can be 2s, and you can still pass. So the bar's not set that high. We'll see. The last thing I want to say are just that when we go through all this, I will be talking about do's and don'ts, things to remember, things to reflect on, things to focus on, and we'll be talking about what each one of these rubrics is really trying to measure and really trying to identify to ourselves. If I'm talking about something like building student knowledge, what does that look like when it's really good? What does it look like when it's kind of okay? And what does it look like when it's really bad? And in that way, we can take these 15 different things that we're trying to talk about and really ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a good teacher in terms of planning, instruction, and assessment? And I'm not saying that's all there is to being a good teacher, but it's a really good place to start. So, general tips about this thing. 1, answer all the prompts carefully. 2, write clearly with a lot of structure. And these first 2 really go into the reasons why people don't do well on this thing. Usually when people don't do well, it's because they are careless, they don't read carefully, they think that what they're doing is obvious, and it's not. And the person who's scoring this is not going to be trying to give you a good score. The burden of proof is on you. You have to provide a compelling case that, yeah, I know how to do this stuff. And here's all the evidence. And it's going to seem repetitive. And I will tell you in class, don't try to get creative in your writing. Don't try to have a variety of words. Don't use a lot of adjectives. Straight to the point, using the same terminology throughout the whole thing. Because that way it becomes really easy for the reader to comprehend what you're trying to say. It doesn't need to be interesting. It just needs to be clear. Third thing is give yourself multiple options for success. So by this I mean, sometimes because you're going to be videotaping a few portions of your teaching, and you should videotape the week before. Just so the kids get used to the camera, should videotape all that week and not just for those segments that you planted, because they may not go that well. Or maybe there's a fire alarm in the middle of it, right? Or maybe you're all set to plan it and all of a sudden there's an unscheduled pep rally because the basketball team is going to state or something. Those things happen, and I don't want you to put all your eggs in one basket and then have that basket be stolen from you, right? Make sure you have a lot of options going forward. So if it doesn't happen on Tuesday, it can happen on Wednesday or on Thursday or on Friday even. I also want you to take the perspective of the scorer when you're writing. Now, people who score these things are retired teachers, retired professors, active teachers and professors, principals, and so on, people in the education field who've gotten a lot of training on this. They're typically doing it for a few extra bucks, and they get paid, I think, $110 last time I checked, for each one of these things. Now, when you look at how much writing and the materials that are involved in this, it's like a good 50 pages worth of stuff. And if I were going to review all that, it would take me several hours. If they're doing this for money, if they can do it in 2 hours, that means they're making $55 an hour. If it takes them 5 hours because it's hard to follow, because it's not clear, because they're having to search or they're not sure what you're trying to do, they might be a little upset because every extra minute is basically lowering their hourly wage, right? So if you take that in mind, or keep that in mind, make things as clear and as structured as you possibly can so they do not have to look. Don't just say, like in my lesson plans, you can see that I did this. Tell them which page, tell them which section, right? So they can go right to it if they need to. Keep that in mind as you're doing this, and you should be fine. Then don't procrastinate. Again, that leads to a lot of bad things where people aren't ready. They're doing something they're not prepared for. They're not comfortable with. They try new things, and this kind of goes into the next thing. Pick something you're comfortable with. Don't try a new instructional strategy during this thing. Figure out what you're going to do ahead of time and practice that to make sure that students know what your expectations are. They know what the procedures are in case there's any transitions. They have an understanding of what you're trying to do, and they're working with kids that they're comfortable with. Don't come up with, hey, we're doing a new seating arrangement today, and all of a sudden you have conflicts erupting all over the place, right? So keep these tips in mind as you go forward. They will come up again as we talk about each section, planning, instruction, and assessment. But for right now, that's the general overview of the EdTPA. The next video will be about the planning tasks. And I'll talk to you again soon.